Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody to Demento Mori podcast about parapolitics, esoterica, crime, and apocalypticism. And this is like a random promptu stream to kind of ruminate over the various different things that I have encountered over the years in my research. I guess you could also say in my spiritual path and all the wackiness that has inferred from things that I have experienced on the internet and in the real world, of course. And on today's subject, I'm going to kind of talk about sort of where I'm at this point in time. And this is going to be a random, impromptu stream to just discuss about various different things that I'm at this point. And I don't usually do these streams that often. Eventually, I'm going to get on a schedule. Um, so just consider this kind of a random impromptu stream where I sort of share some of my research, which could converge on various different topics from esoterica down to parapolitics, depending on whatever mood I'm in or depending on whatever interests me at the moment. So, I mean, you could kind of consider this sort of a crypto sort of schizoid stream. I kind of go and ride the waves of, whatever the world is going through right now. So one of the recurrent topics that I've been looking into the Chinvat bridge in the Zoroastrian belief system. And this interests me because as of lately, I've been delving into the Kabbalah, the verboten text for many people, and there's not a lot of reliable information when you go down the road and looking into the Kabbalah or looking into esoterica. Fortunately, I have somewhat of a grounding in these various different topics, but like I said, and I mentioned previously, I'm just going to look into this and just go into this and dive into this whole thing. That's been sort of my mission now, is just to dive into these things and immerse myself into these various different topics with no concern about whatever my sanity or wherever the path may lead me. I'm a very adventurous person. I like to sometimes, let's just say, dwell on the wild side. And if you've been following me for all these years that I have been streaming, I'm not saying that I have a consistently large base of people, but the few people that have followed me over the years have seen sort of my development and evolution, can kind of attest to that I am not afraid to delve into certain topics. As with this particular podcast and with this live stream, I like to sometimes talk about issues concerning our society, which a lot of researchers and a lot of people would not touch. That is the typical framework of stuff like extremism and how that overlaps with various different disciplines, be it parapolitics or be it esoterica, which sometimes all these things converge together to make and quite an interesting foray into the political landscape. And over the years, I've sort of gained a lot of insight, and a lot of people I've interacted with online, offline, through the various different, let's just say, political spectrums that I have chosen to interact with. Good or bad, negative or positive, these things have shaped my worldview, and I'm very blessed to have encountered many people, albeit even the negative people have taught me much about myself internally and much about the world externally. And through all these things, I've kind of reemerged a rediscovery of where my place in society is. And also, as of lately, I've wanted to strike out and sort of develop my own sort of worldview and not stand in the shadows of other people. Typically, you kind of see me on other people's podcast, and I'm usually discussing, topics like the years of lead. I'm occasionally talking about, sort of the extremist landscape that America has turned into over the years. But now I want to kind of develop and bridge into what I consider another journey in my existence. I have been thinking a lot about the consciousness that we all experience in our waking life, and all of the things that sort of go along with that. And this led me down into spirituality. Coming from a Judeo Christian evangelical background, I had many questions about the existence, even in my youth. And, I thought about the cosmos, went in briefly into studying the various different cosmogonies of, the ancient Egyptians. I've gotten into the Hellenistic people, although I will admit a lot of my knowledge base about the Hellenistic people was very limited. It's very scant in scope. And I also had the privilege to interact with many different people that exposed me to the worldview of the Eastern world. I have read various different texts, including a lot of forbidden academic texts of very controversial perennialist and also traditionalist thinkers. That included the typically verboten Julius Evola. I've briefly ventured into the dangerous and treacherous territory of the left-hand path. I'm not going to name the specific group that I'm talking about, but if anybody is acquainted with the occult landscape online, are very much aware of these people. So, my method of looking into these things is kind of detachment, which limits me in my scope because I don't like to politically entangle myself with any ideologies anymore. I've learned this can be a very, very disastrous thing to do as a researcher and someone that's also an aspiring adept. This can be something that is very detrimental not only to your mental health, which I mentioned previously that I have discarded that because I want truly inner understanding of myself and the world around me. So if you see me referencing certain particular people, it doesn't necessarily mean endorsement. I am only utilizing these texts and utilizing this as my own sort of personal research that I want to share with my limited but devoted audience. And I do want to emphasize that my limited and devoted audience is very much appreciated. And I don't say that in a condescending type of way. I say that in total love and total care. And also, as a devoted sort of researcher, I have attempted to balance all the different worldviews, all the different streams of thought and consciousness, and to condense it to try to help others that may be along that path. But now, as for now, I don't endorse anybody in particular. I don't endorse any political mindset. I will say that, you know, I am not really to the far right as I once was. I have sort of broadened my horizons and realized that a lot of political discourse, unfortunately, in like the modern sphere is a lot of it is dogma, a lot of it is limited, and a lot of it creates sort of a distorted sort of pathway. So, with that said, I don't really have a particular topic to discuss other than the Chinvat Bridge. And like I said, also, my understanding of Zoroastrianism, which is what the Chinvat Bridge emerges from, is somewhat limited as well. But I find this particular concept to be especially interesting. Foremost, as I've looked up the various different Sephiroth in the Kabbalistic tree, I have discovered that various different Sephiroth um, seems to coincide with a lot of different other belief systems. One in particular is the Neoplatonist worldview, which, again, I will emphasize my exposure to the Neoplatonic systems is ongoing. And it is ongoing to the point to where I don't want to speak authoritatively on it. I simply want to discuss some of what I have tried to piece together. And that is Plotinus, Plocuus. Forgive me if I'm also mispronouncing these words, as commonplace in these live streams. If you see me mispronouncing words, and I know that makes a lot of people cringe, just know that I am trying to develop, you know, a working sort of ontology of these various different belief systems. So, going back to the Chinvat Bridge, one thing that has fascinated me from my inception and from my youth is the liminal spaces between the living and dying realms. For a lack of vocabulary, I will simply resort to calling them living and dying realms. The underworld is something in particular that has fascinated me. And it seems also that the consciousness that are within the underworld, that in our existence, we seem to experience, let's just say, in dream cycles. And boy, over the years, I've had very vivid, often not disturbing, but very vivid, very surreal dreams. And these surreal dreams have, fortunately, impacted me in a very positive way. So I was thinking about, and I'm starting here with my frame base, and that is the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun went through varying different cycles. This correlated to the hours of the day. This also correlated to the various different gates that the ancient Egyptians looked to as being pathways to the underworld. And the underworld, of course, the Egyptians, quite contrary to what the modern day Western and mundane world sees as, just kind of a final exit place, they saw it as a reemergence and a place to where someone could experience a type of spiritual rebirth, rejuvenation. And that very much is a part of my life. And I know on the internet, often when the discourse of the occult, the magical, or anything that is beyond the realms of the Christian context is often discussed quite sadly and framed in a type of diabolical and somewhat sinister aspect. And I think this is rather unfortunate because this is probably going to make a lot of people mad, is that the occult is not necessarily evil or good. This is the dualistic aspect of morality. Of course, there are certain universals and ground laws that various different cultural people practice that is universal. But our modern day understanding, our manichaeistic understanding of morality, I think, has binded us and it has encapsulated us into our sort of prison, our demiurgic prison. And you have to understand, over the years, this has given me a lot of grief to try to reconcile all this together because of my Judeo Christian background, which I'm not here also to necessarily, castigate any of the Christians as well. I openly embrace all different walks of life on this live stream. And I ask people to have this certain understanding and move beyond the sort of loose farming aspects of the internet into something that is something a bit of understanding. We don't have to necessarily all get along, agree, and eventually, probably a lot of us eventually will be dogmatic as we tend to go back to what shaped us and our reality from our youth. But I think we should, and I'm not preaching necessarily ecumenicalism or universalism because I'm unsure of those kind of concepts. I'm unsure of things like synchronism and some of these other aspects. And like I said, this is sort of a journey for me that I want to take by myself. Others along the way will probably appear, but this is, I would say, a kind of self-initiatory type of process. And like I said, I welcome and embrace differing points of views and differing aspects, as I appreciate all these things. As I've always been the person that has liked to interact, um, almost to my detriment, to polarizing people of various different political spectrums. It's quite unfortunate that people in this day and age sort of limit themselves, cloister themselves off to almost monasteries of the mind, and almost to the aspect to where they house and enclose themselves into these sort of hermetically sealed spaces where their worldviews foment and their worldviews sort of entrap them and snare them. And I believe also in Kabbalah, you could consider things that ensnare and entrap you to be klipoths. And klipothic and demiurgic type of entities, to some, I think they worship that because they like the chaos, and there's nothing wrong necessarily with the chaos. Chaos is part of our existence, it's part of our world, so it should never be eschewed. It should always be sort of embraced. And I'm going to warn people also that if you choose to accept and go through this type of journey upon your own, be very careful, be very wary, because like our secular and like mundane existence says that spirituality says that all these different forms do not exist. But I assure you, this is not how the ancient people saw the world. I'm also not, let me just also highlight, I am not a Reconstructionist. I don't believe the antiquity, the ancient world can be reconstructed. For a long time, because of like the state of like the world today, I've tried, I immerse myself in also the trap of nostalgia, yearning for like the better days, yearning for the past. But I think as we move forward, we have to reconcile the past and we have to also forge sort of a new existence. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding new agey or any of these other things, or this is woo woo to people. Like I said, we all start somewhere. And because my sort of spiritual path and my sort of reawakening of sorts has been sort of self guided, I am not immune to many of the different flaws, many of the different errors in my way. So don't expect me as to be any type of guru because I don't deserve the title. Also, this is not false modesty or false humility. I really do not deserve the title. Lots of people will, when they are researchers or when they are podcasters or various different people you'll run into a lot of charlatans until you peel away the layers and you can discern for yourself good information. Now, what are the metrics to measuring if something is good information or bad information? And this all is dependent upon your mind state. For a lot of people, because of the algorithm and because of, the misguidance in our society, we tend to cling to personalities and we tend to cling to people that we feel in confidence, which are always not the best guides to be the people to guide the way. But I will argue that you yourself, and this is not to sound solipsistic or egotistical, you yourself are the best guide for this path. You yourself have to, you have to internally sort of look at yourself and see if, whatever pathway is appropriate for you. And I've struggled with that over the years. I will admit, a lot of polarized politics, a lot of these different sort of worldviews, they give way to cultic type of underpinnings. And a lot of people, because they are sort of drunk on power, they are drunk on guiding people, and also because of the fragmented reality that a lot of us live in, we typically go towards these things. That very much is also a part of this podcast as well. Looking into the cultic milieu of these various different groups. One in particular that I have studied over the years is Shinrikyo. I've looked into Shinrikyo, which came to my attention around in 2019, although I had previously known about them, from my childhood, looking into the various different groups. So this is also a part of this podcast. This is also a part of understanding, of, looking at the world and discerning the world around us. So, like I said, I have given you guys limited exposure to all these details, but that's because I have been undergoing sort of personal development. And through that personal development, sometimes also it's not very good to enclose yourself off from, society, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to seal yourself away from society in order to gain what is truth and what is reality. And you have to block out a lot of the extra noise that comes with the internet. And I realize this is contradictory in many aspects because we depend on the internet in our daily lives to, to like our friend groups. Some of us like do our shopping online. Some of us do, a lot of our everyday lives online. So it would be very contradictory to say just completely isolate yourself. But for some people, this is a choice, and for some others people, this is not a choice. Because of the way, like I said, that the world is structured now, and the world is, isolation is very much a part of our existence. And you're kind of seen as a loser or someone that is sort of asocial to discuss any of these issues. But I think it is very vital and important to discuss these things. So let me also like just pull up this website real quick, if I could, and look into the Chinvat Bridge. So bear with me a little bit. I'm going to try to pull up this particular website I found on the Chinvat Bridge and kind of discuss it a little bit. And like I said, going back to like the underworld is mysterious to a lot of people. Does the underworld represent a certain type of consciousness? Does it represent a sort of undercurrent or shadow self that is dormant in a lot of us? I know Carl Jung is sort of a very controversial figure, but he did have some very vital points about the shadow self. And sometimes people look at the shadow self and they look at integration as being sort of a negative and sort of things that pre-exist within our consciousness that we don't always look into. So let me just look into the Chinbot bridge here a little bit. And I don't want to I want to find like a reputable website so I can discuss the Chinbot bridge. I don't want to use like stuff like AI. I have grown very weary of a lot of AI stuff. So, and like I mentioned previously, I don't speak with any kind of authority, but I do believe on the Sipparothic Archery of Life. It's sort of seen as like the 11th Sipparoth, which is the hidden or submerged Sipparoth. And you have to understand, for all the people that are kind of Kabbalah-phobic out there, you wouldn't really have a lot of Western esotericism, contrary to what a lot of people think or a lot of people say, without the Kabbalistic tree. The Kabbalistic tree is sort of essential to people that want to explore Western esotericism. It's not a bad thing, contrary to what people say. I've looked thoroughly into the various different controversial opinions and thoughts about the Kabbalistic tree, and I found most of them to be nonsense, to be quite honest with you. For most part, I don't look at the Kabbalistic tree as necessarily something for world domination, necessarily. And like I said previously, I know the occult and all the rest of the stuff is sort of a dirty word to people because, to be quite frank and honest with you, a lot of people have abused it. And when you look into a lot of these different practitioners, even if you look into the life of people like Crowley and some of the others, they have quite a sordid past. The truth about this is that human beings, as we exist on this earth and this planet, we all have a dark and a light side. The key is to, I guess, to integrate the both so one doesn't subsume the other. Because if you have too much white light, then you sort of become submissive and meek. And if you have too much darkness, you become sort of a tyrant. So I suppose some people would argue this is sort of the gray area and zone, and there has to be balance, just like with the water and fire elements that are discussed in alchemical processes. Because you have all these different things. They're not necessarily bad upon themselves. And you can conflate these things with your various different personalities, your various different developments in life. And some of us, of course, using the Kabbalistic tree are just stuck in Malkuth. And that sort of like shades our whole entire existence, and people don't really get above a lot of our animal level of self. And you have to understand the animal level of self is not necessarily a bad thing. It's primordial. It's something that's intrinsic to us, but it's something that we have to overcome in our development. And like I said, I don't want to delude anybody into or foster any kind of misconception about these things. I understand this is not everybody's cup of tea, and I will assure you that this particular stream is not geared to solely one subject. And that's confusing to a lot of people because people like very specialized things. And I feel that specialized things sort of relegates you down to just a cog. I like to study various different things and sometimes find the intersection between these things and sometimes find some of the valid things. And, even that itself, if you compartmentalize too much or if you synchronize stuff too much, it can be detrimental. Like I said, I don't like to do that as well. I like to find some medium and some balance to a lot of these other particular issues. So I want to say also that this is an introductory stream. This is not necessary. I'm not going in depth in any of this content. That is going to be ongoing. That is going to be something that I discuss on a regular basis. Probably I'm going to try to do it at least 2 times a month, um, until eventually I sort of build something up to where I can maybe form a type of platform. Because, like I said, I'm sort of beginning all over again. And this is like sort of what happens with society. You don't necessarily die a spiritual death. You don't necessarily, like the ancient Egyptians had this concept to where, your heart is weighed as light as a feather, and if you did not pass the negative confessions of Ma'at, you sort of just were eviscerated and evaporated into the atmosphere. You just were annihilated. And reality in life itself is that we undergo a lot of different annihilations. We undergo a lot of dead ends. And anyone that tells you otherwise, that people have not underwent dead ends, are lying to you. If you know you haven't been annihilated spiritually in your lifetime, these people are lying to you and trying to sell you, a lot of misconceptions. Yeah. I'm also going to try to steer away from controversy in this stream. I realize that controversy is sort of the means of the internet now. I myself am quite a controversial figure, but for other reasons. And I don't really want to address this on this stream as I feel like it is a distraction. Just take me at my face value that I am going to discuss these things with the utmost sincerity and honesty as I try to explore them. And let's get into the Chinvat Bridge. And so basically, the Chinvat Bridge is sort of this narrow bridge to where your sins and all your indiscretions on this earth, you walk on this bridge sort of like a thin sort of razor, because the chasm that's beneath this bridge is an everlasting chasm. This is sort of like the whole bottomless pit to where you just struggle. And something that I looked into when I was looking into Da'at, which I believe is sort of one of those separate type of bridges, is that the separate is you're getting close to Keter, you're getting close to this various other, and like I said, I'm not an authority. I'm just speaking off what I have researched, unfortunately, quite secondhand because I'm not a Kabbalistic scholar, but I'm imparting into you like the best I have gleaned from various different resources that are available to me, is that to get to sort of and cross the abyss, you have to walk past this sort of very thin bridge. And this bridge is it's a lot like judgment. It's a lot like also crossing the underworld as you go to get judged by, um, Anubis or Anpu, to Isis, Aset, who's holding the scales, and of course Jehuti or Thoth, some people will know, as sort of writing down your deeds and reflecting upon these various different things that have happened over the course of your life. And I'm not one to speculate about where the judgment came in Christianity or in Islam or the Abrahamic faiths. Because if you look at, Judaism, which is where Christianity developed from, Judaism doesn't really have a point like this in the early First Temple period. It only has a thing called Sheol, which is the underworld. It has Gehenna, which is the prototype. In later times, people believe developed into hell. Even that's sort of like very speculative, and a lot of what we perceive as hell is something that comes from Dante's Inferno and from the from John Milton, the Pilgrim's Progress, not process. So a lot of that comes from later medieval times and from these various different like thinkers like Dante. And this is not really shaped or coordinated in any direction. It is codified, of course, by later sort of Christian theologians. But the Zoroastrians are like the original formulators of this sort of concept. And what I found interesting in looking at just the histography of the Kabbalah itself is that you have to wonder if like Zoroastrian concepts somehow diffused, and maybe through the form of Mithraism, diffused into Neoplatonic study, because there's a text called the Journey of the Dream of Scipio, which talks about going through the various different spheres on a pathway or a journey. And they go from sphere to sphere. This is, of course, seen in Plato's Timaeus. And of course, Plato himself even had a concept of a type of machine, type of demiurgic system. Even though Plato itself is mostly philosophical content, there are some spiritual undercurrents and stuff like Timaeus that has like fascinated me. And you would even like find a lot of concepts in Timaeus in a lot of like early astrology. When you look into like early astrology, a lot of it was about following the forms of the heavens and following the forms of the planets, and this sort of highly influenced a lot of later texts that, like the Picatrix, which is like very, and I have an avid fascination with Picatrix as well, because the Haranians, the people that lived in Turkey, preserved a lot of the Neoplatonic thought. This was a group of Islamic thinkers around the time period. And so like I have a very like sort of vivid interest in Anatolia, or Asia Minor itself is very pivotal to the formation of stuff like Stoicism. So when you look into like the Hellenistic stuff, and one thing that also coincides with a lot of like apocalypticism is prophecy, right? You can blame a lot of my early curiosity into dispensationalism, which is not a very good belief system, even if you are a Christian, to where your destiny should be tied to certain elements in later periods of time. This ties, believe it or not, this ties back to, I believe, the Plymouth Society. So you often wonder, why is there all this fascination with the apocalypse in modern day Christianity? Why does this exist? Primarily, this kind of exists because of the Plymouth Society. John Nelson Darby. What's interesting is that Aleister Crowley's father was one of the adherents of the Plymouth Society. And this is probably why a young Aleister Crowley not only utilized this to develop his aeonic system, but also rebelled against a lot of his father's teaching, as a lot of children often do with their parents. They rebel, and this led to Crowley's fascination with the Scarlet Lady, with the whole seals of the Apocalypse of Revelations. Now, growing up as a kid, I also was deeply intrigued by the various different seals of the Revelations. It still fascinates me how St. John the Revelator conceived of all this, supposedly on the island of Patmos. This still fascinates me. Even though I wouldn't call myself a Christian, I wouldn't say that I'm immersed in Christian belief system. I mean, teach their own. I don't judge. I don't judge people based on their belief systems. Whatever you believe in, as long as it's not detrimental to you or greater society, I guess you're on the right path, because like I said, we all have a entry point into looking at all these things. So the reason also, just to circle back a little bit to the reason why I'm doing all this, is because I got into eschatology, and I didn't truly, and the thing about it is I'm being honest, I don't understand thoroughly a lot of these concepts. I try my best to piece together a lot of these concepts. I try with my limited scope, through self-revelation and through research and study, because both are important if you're going to go down this path. And I think truth is very vital, not only about yourself, but greater society. When you look into these things, I think that's very important when you sort of use this as a guide and utilize it as a tool for development. That you sort of understand some of the, I guess, like I said, going back to the Kabbalah, some of the Klipothic type of things that intercede with your, stagnation, your spiritual stagnation. And part of that, I think, was my childhood looking into the book of Revelations. And I think this led me down a very nihilistic path. This also put a distaste for a lot of mainline Protestant Christianity. This also limited, I believe, and put me in a kind of demiurgic trap of nihilism, which, it's a very big undercurrent in modern day society. I think if you look also at, Nietzsche, which a lot of people like to cite, but I think a lot of people don't understand Nietzsche as well. I didn't understand Nietzsche to a certain extent, and still don't completely grasp the whole concept that Nietzsche is talking about in his text. I think you have passive nihilism and you have active nihilism. I'm not necessarily sure either one of them that are intrinsically positive, but they are like mind states. And like I said, Nietzsche is also another character that, not necessarily a spiritualist or an occultist, but I can imagine he probably influenced also people like Crowley as well. I don't know the direct link between Crowley or Nietzsche, but I'm pretty sure. And by the way, when I mention these various different people, I'm not endorsing them. I do realize the limitations. I do realize the flaws in all these people. And when you look into this, is quite unfortunate when we look into a lot of these people that may have had certain insights into the world. We start to see that they have character flaws. So while we can acknowledge a lot of these people are sus to a certain aspect, we have to acknowledge that if you are into magic, if you're into occultism, you have to acknowledge that they did kind of lead the way for a lot of further development or understanding. And even if you are anti-occultist, let's just say you're anti-occultist, you don't like occultism, you think it is something that is detrimental to the world, you can still glean a lot of insights into looking into the sort of development of this in Western society and even in Eastern society, not to exclude anybody, because I don't talk on Eastern, Eastern esotericism because I'm not that well versed in Eastern esotericism. It's not something I have limited exposure to it from reading, of course, the controversial and often flawed character of Julius Evola. But I don't know anything beyond that, and I don't know how much Evola actually understood Eastern esotericism, as I can't measure that. Like I said, I'm sort of a baby on my path to looking into this. And one thing I want to say also, I'm not a trend hopper. I noticed online a lot of people have heightened discussions in esotericism because I think it's probably very popular because, we live in sort of a void of a society right now to where things are chaotic and people are looking to something to try to control their life and balance their life and provide a counterbalance to answer some of the looming questions. So, like I said, I'm not necessarily, I don't endorse all these people, but I think you can't neglect these people. I don't necessarily like academic discourse about esotericism, but because I am a bit of a failed academic myself, going into anthropology into my university years and wanting to be an anthropologist, I also am quite a sort of failed academic myself. But I think concerning these issues, I think they're, like I mentioned, and I keep repeating this, is it can be a balance. It doesn't have to necessarily be adversarial when you look into these aspects. You know, another cringy sort of interest of mine, and I realize a lot of people probably think this is cringy, is I'm wanting to know how technology, how the internet, and how all of these things sort of interface and develop. Because I know one thing, even though we went through the Enlightenment, the Western society went through the Enlightenment, the spiritual tie that people had when they developed from what people would call superstitious or what people called a kind of more, let's just say, superstitious on, ways of looking at the world. We didn't totally sever off our ties or cut that, cosmic cord uh, completely. If you look at a lot of Renaissance to Enlightenment thinkers, a lot of them had deep ties to esotericism. I don't have to remind you. Isaac Newton had ties to numerology, had ties to alchemy. People like Goethe, which is a powerhouse that is part of the German idealistic mindset, also had ties to esotericism. And of course, Hegel, which is often overplayed about Hegel's connection to Hermeticism. This is sort of underplayed. Now, one notion I want to reject completely is I don't believe, and this is going back to the Hellenistic thinkers, I don't believe Plato was some type of Kabbalist, because I've heard people try to state, and a lot of these people are looking for where they believe Western society went wrong. They often postulate that because the pre-Socratics and because Plato and people like Pythagoras may have had influences from the Mesopotamian area, from Asia Minor, that necessarily this is flawed. And therefore, this is, incalculable towards reconciling this with the Western notions. And I'm not even, to be quite honest with you, I'm not sure that I even like the Western notions of esotericism. I'm not 100% certain it's necessarily my pathway, but it's something I'm definitely exploring. It's something I'm trying to look at objectively as I look into like Hermeticism and these various different concepts. I'm trying, with all honesty, to embrace a lot of these things and look into them. But like I said, as a kind of failed academic, um, I sort of still look at and frame things to how a lot of ways that I was taught in my anthropology classes, like post-structuralist, structuralist type of anthropology. I'm not sure how to divorce that other than I can try to marry all these concepts together and try to form a sort of peaceful synthesis of a lot of these ideas. So bear with me, audience. Bear with me, audience. I'm trying my best to reconcile a lot of these things together. Because, in even like going back to more secular stuff like parapolitics, looking at also a lot of people that have sort of dark past and looking how like the intersection of politics and even occultism works, which is kind of a popular pastime for a lot of people in these spheres because the connections do exist and they are there. But you have to understand also a lot of these people that were practicing a lot of these diabolical themes in their sort of praxis were not only flawed individuals, but they probably didn't have a very deep understanding of esotericism themselves. They didn't understand, the golden chain of humanity that Giordano Bruno talks about. They didn't look into the Hermetic type of memory that Giordano Bruno looked into. They didn't have a good grasp of it. So it sort of annoys me that sometimes people get lost in their own sort of pet projects to where they don't understand these things completely. And I've tried to tread that ground very lightly because I have friends and, companions in the world that are into the esotericism. And I also have people that don't like esotericism, that find probably the occult not only antithetical to their own Christian or personal practice, or for whatever reason they think that it has been shaded by diabolic intentions over the years. I have people that oftentimes, that is a confliction. And I'm just sitting over here. I'm trying to be objective. I'm trying to just be a researcher and I'm trying to understand these things. And oftentimes this brings me into a lot of conflict with people. And people often get the misperceived notions about myself or about what my intentions are. As of now, I am a journeyer looking into these things. I am a person trying to find solace and truth in these various different things. At the same time, I'm also a parapolitical researcher. I find parapolitics to be very interesting, albeit from the left or right side of the aisle. I find these issues to be very interesting. I also find very dark subject matters as it pertains to even people like Program to Kill and Dave McGowan to be interesting. I find also labor history in America to be interesting. I find, the Epstein stuff to be interesting. I find, organized crime and how it was shaped through the early America to be interesting. So a lot of these things you might see, I'm typically when I go on podcast, I don't try to, I try to detach myself, probably to my own detriment, because a lot of the audience doesn't feel like they can connect to me because I haven't shared a lot of personal anecdotes about my life but I do like sharing these things. But I also realize that in many instances, you develop ops or rivals online for whatever reason. Believe me, for whatever course you're trying to take online, you're going to find you have ops. You have people that think you are up to something else other than what you're up to. So it's sort of like treading that sort of schizoid paranoia that comes along with talking these topics, because quite unfortunately, it is true that governmental agencies abuse the occult. I have my own. They abuse the occult through Operation Stargate, through MK Ultra, MK Ultra, you name it. They abused a lot of these things and extracted a lot of knowledge. A very evil man, Sidney Gottlieb, and some of the other people that were involved in all these operations, they were very much occultist and very much dark practitioners. If you whatever you want to say of that term, they did have very bad intentions. But like I said, can look at it as type of an art form or a tool that can be utilized for whatever your will make it. Because a lot of it is determined on your will, and a lot of it reveals, what is truly inside of you internally, whether you are truly a good person or not. And like I said, I don't like to judge. I don't like to be the person that castigates or judges people. I just want to seek truth, knowledge, and understand how that pertains to myself. Whatever journey you're on, I wish you the best, and I wish you blessings. So let me go and see if there's like anyone in the chat that has any questions, or if anybody has any objections to what I've said. I've went on my monologue. I am going to keep this stream up because I think this stream in particular is this is not an official type of podcast or official thing that I'm doing. It's just something I'm discussing. I do want to mention something very interesting in current events as it pertains to the magical world. I believe Peter Carroll, the chaos magician, who was very influential in, and then I think also to Kenneth Grant, Osmond Spare, and people like that. They were very influential in developing sort of sigil and chaos magic, although it's deeper than that. This led into, subcultures like Discordianism and Robert Anton Wilson and Church of the Subgenius and those various different things. I think, as controversial as those things are, we wouldn't have a lot of internet culture that we have now if it was not for those people. So the way that like he sort of is an influential figure, which I will acknowledge, we wouldn't have a lot of like memetics and a lot of like practices that a lot of people take for granted. And chaos magic is something that I'm on the fence about. I'm sort of on the fence about chaos magic. It's but it is not necessary. Like I said, circling back to something I said, is that you have to understand the antiquity was not dualistic as it pertains to morality. This doesn't give you, you can look at it like kind of in the low IQ aspect, that this just gives people sort of the will to be as evil as possible. That's not what that means. That's not what it means. Even in like chaos, there's a certain responsibility that someone has if you are an adept. And I'm not speaking as if I'm an adept, but from my cursory understanding, is that if you're well versed in this, and that will come to another. Let me just put a pin in that topic. Baneful magic is something that I probably will discuss as well, because it's very popular. If you go on TikTok, if you go on other platforms, you'll notice there's these people that practice baneful magic, usually against people they disagree with politically or people they have problems with. And in some courses, I'm not going to totally condemn people that necessarily practice baneful magic, other than say, in certain instances, when if someone is like transgressed against you and they've done wrong to you and it's justifiable, there's nothing wrong with it. Because sometimes people skirt our legal system, and sometimes people transgress upon you that is no recourse, that you sometimes have to get vengeance. And vengeance is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can lead to your own path of destruction if you don't integrate your sort of shadow self and your darker instincts, which we're all born with. Contrary to what people say, our darker instincts are not just confined to characters. They are intrinsic in everybody, down to your minister at your church, down to your priest, down to holy men. Everyone has this capable, I think, of darker instincts. And I'm not going to sit here and say that only particular, figures throughout history or, humanity itself, that, some people, unfortunately, are sort of born with those instincts. And I would argue, and this is just the step aside from just the esoteric talk, is that some of these people that are, have darker capabilities often are talking about doing good. This seems to be like a concept that a lot of people misunderstand in like the Western world. Is a lot of people who do good deeds, it's cover. It's cover for a lot of their real intentions. And a lot of philanthropic millionaires and billionaires, they will participate in philanthropy as a cover for a lot of their bad deeds. And if anything, if like, parapolitical researchers, and this is a little bit of annoyance of mine, they will disclose a lot of this stuff, this information, but they won't really give you insight into how this applies to your everyday life. So this does apply to our everyday life. And this is just to get out on a tangent about, you know, about parapolitics here. I know it annoys some people that I utilize that term, and some people are not even aware of what that term means. But I'm sure a lot of people in this audience are familiar with what parapolitics is. But if you're not, it's sort of a term that was like discussed, made popular, I believe, by Peter Dale Scott. Discussed, I believe, sometime in the 70s, about how some things in political theory on the far left or far right or the left right spectrum or wherever you lie, these things have, undergirding type of instances where it's beyond that scope. It's beyond like the scope of these two binaries. These two binaries don't combine political theory. And it discusses a lot of fringe topics, as well as stuff that is covered in assassinations, conspiracies, and also about money sources. I mean, that's put it in its most reductionist, sort of simplified term as I can, but it's sort of like the side politics and something that is like subterranean as it pertains to like political discourse. And like I said, I hope I've conveyed a lot of my thoughts and people appreciate the stream. And I will now like go and answer like anybody has any questions to talk about. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Might be a dumb question, but is this a dark cell? I subscribe to this channel, but I don't remember what this channel is about, and not many post on this channel. This channel is about parapolitics, esoterica, and also about random cultural critique. of the modern day society. This is like what this channel is about. This particular channel in particular is not really confined to like one subject. So I don't just discuss one subject. I discuss a multiplicity of various different subjects, and some of them controversial and some of them not. Um, and if you find yourself kind of lost in what I'm discussing, make sure to ask me questions. Try not to, I will ask you, try not to ask me too many racy questions, as I'm not trying to lose my channel. And I'm not trying to go too far off the deep end that a lot of people on the internet does. I'm trying to leave it concise and to the point and to talk about these subjects. I mean, I am going to cover more things thoroughly and in depth, but this is like sort of a channel that I made to try to understand subject matter that I had an interest in, which is parapolitics, esoteric, and apocalypticism, put in its most basic format. I do appreciate your subscription, but I don't think this channel is a quote unquote dark cell channel. I don't think that pertains to this channel. But you're more than welcome on this channel, but no, not explicitly what you're discussing. Let me see what also. Okay. Wasn't sure, got on YouTube in my subs, seen live, clicked, and maybe it was a different channel name. See, a lot of people think because of my name, Demento Mori, that I'm necessarily a doomer. No, I'm not a doomer. I just like embracing both the light and the dark. And I think both are essential in discourse and human existence. So I don't shy away from either one of those particular topics. And so, no, I'm not a doomer. I'm not within the doomer subculture or within those sort of mind states. As of now, I would call myself more of an esotericist, more of a person that wants to get deeper into esoteric discourse and looking into these very different topics. So that's sort of where this channel is going. So let me see who else has a comment. Let's see. Gehenna is a physical place, while the other is a spiritual place. Well, you have to understand, when we talk about like spiritual and physical places, the people in antiquity, which is what the people of the Bible were, just as the ancient Egyptians and the Assyrians and everyone surrounding those particular cultures, they didn't really separate spiritual space from physical space. So a lot of the spiritual space is sort of a map onto their physical space, and their physical space is sort of a map onto their metaphysical space, if that makes sense to you. That's the most basic way I can, explain that, and that's why I was talking today about the bridge of Chinvat, which is a concept of like the judgment bridge in Zoroastrianism, which, I will probably eventually do a stream to talk about that. The more resources and material I gather to talk about it. So, you have to understand there's not a lot of separation between physical and spiritual, like real estate or or geography. Not a lot of difference between the two. Because like you look, just to give the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Egyptians I'm most comfortable with. I mean, even like amongst the ancient Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, they have different concepts of the underworld. Like our very term of the abyss comes from a Mesopotamian term that means abzu, which is the water into the water. And the Egyptians have a very a different underworld. Like the underworld within the Mesopotamians was more of like a clouded space that had different entities within it that they believed lived within these spaces. The Egyptians had sort of the same concept, but their underworld was more of a passageway to, let's just say, the stars. It was more of a passageway between the living and unliving realms of the world. And the modern day rural Egyptians still actually believe in a lot of these concepts that the pharaohs believed in, which I have touched upon as well in other podcasts that I've discussed. They have, they believed in a lot of, they believed in like the living and dying realms of the world were not that much different from one another. They had a true connection to a lot of their, ancestors, and they believed that, their ancestors could intervene in a lot of their worldly affairs. And I believe, there are people that call this like the hungry ghost that are prevalent. I believe also maybe the Norse had these concepts as well. So, these are like kind of universal concepts. So a lot of what you find with the early archaic Hebrews was not a lot different from the surrounding people. They just didn't have as developed of an underworld concept as the ancient Egyptians had until I would say the Second Temple period. So that's sort of what I'm gathering at. But I will try to discuss that later on. Let me see what else. I noticed that an Orthodox Jew didn't understand what Gehenna was. I think it was because he used the Old Testament by the quote. Well, no comment on that. But I, I think I don't want to get this. I don't want to discuss Judaism. I only reference Judaism to show that as a framework into the underworld. So, okay. Well, guys, I think this is probably going to be it for now. I thank you guys for tuning in, for looking into my channel, and I encourage people to also further look forward to like other things that I'm going to discuss in the future. This has been an introduction to sort of my path working and pathway and my bridge into my reemergence towards destiny. Thank you very much for tuning in. I thank you, each and every one of you, and send you blessings. And for that, have a good night.